Ready? So, great pleasure to now introduce Richard Irvine from the University of Cambridge. Richard.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to talk about today is the way in which the looming sixth mass extinction opens up a sense of catastrophe as a shared future. So what I want to talk about is the way that the anticipation of ruin and the way in which ruin leaves its mark in time becomes a shared narrative frame. And in particular, what I'm going to talk about is dust as a particular figure of ruin and how that plays out in three different settings. But the context for what I want to talk about here, I think, can best be explained with pleasing alliteration as a convergence of catastrophisms. What is it that I mean by this? Well, James Hutton's theory of the composition, dissolution, and restoration of land upon the globe in 1788 heralded a new orthodoxy for geological science. I mean, what he talked about was the idea of the Earth, going back to this morning's keynote, I suppose, the Earth as beautiful machine is how he describes it. And it's a process that he's describing of continual but slow and imperceptible changes in geology over the vastness of time, which famously, to quote Hutton, leaves us with no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. And this later came to be described as Uniformitarianism, because it's uniformity of natural laws, of geological processes, and of rates of change that are being described. And this, as I said, became a geological orthodoxy to be contrasted with approaches to geology which place the emphasis on cataclysmic disaster as driving forces, as shaping influences in Earth's history. Now, in principle, of course, there's no inherent distinction between catastrophism and uniformitarianism as distinctions between theistic and atheistic understandings of time. In fact, James Hutton went to considerable lengths to explain the conformity of his theory with biblical understandings of time. And he wrote a lengthy preface, which was not subsequently published, but which goes to lengths to try and explain this. And all the same, if you're talking about cataclysmic events, that doesn't necessarily infer that there's a hand of God at work there. Nevertheless, the significance of these two modes of explanation in early 19th century scientific debate as the difficulty of trying to conform this new uniformitarian orthodoxy with biblical time, this led to this association of catastrophism with literalist readings of the Bible, as it, firstly because there's no deep time required here. You can frame catastrophism within the shorter period of time that certain readings of the Bible would seem to be suggesting, as also it accounts for particular events documented in the Bible. You can read the biblical, the flood into the fossil records. So biblicism becomes this nurturing environment over history for catastrophism. And this is symbolized in the infamous Scopes monkey trial. It becomes this parallel theorization of geology, which is very well described by the anthropologist Susan Harding, who's done very interesting ethnographic work of creation museums, which are really providing this separate but parallel account of the geological processes at work. Now, the point I'm trying to make here, this sort of historical ramble, is that we're seeing the divergence of two narrative frames of time. Yet, and I think this is a somewhat recent development, yet the recognition of mass extinction events as events in Earth's history, particularly through Raup and Sepkoski's 1982 statistical identification of the big five mass extinction events, and subsequently the Alvarez's championing of an extraterrestrial cause for the Cretaceous Tertiary event and the subsequent discovery of the iridium marker as a sign of that impact. What this does is it brings catastrophe back into the frame of deep time. And indeed, we see this with the opening up of debates about the Anthropocene and about the sixth mass extinction. And I think this constitutes, if not a return of the repressed, then certainly a revived neocatastrophism. The significance of cataclysm in geological time is something which we now, I think, take for granted, including our own cataclysm. So what I'm trying to say here is we are all catastrophists now. And catastrophism invests this sense of rupture in time and end-time thinking in the context of the sixth mass extinction as a trope well beyond biblicism. And I want to explore this kind of catastrophic thinking through, as I said, three different figurations of dust. So the first iteration of dust I want to talk about is Eugene Thacker's 2011 book, philosopher Eugene Thacker, his book, In the Dust of This Planet. And I want to look at this both as a theoretical resource, but also as, more importantly, I think, as an expression of a particular cultural phenomenon, which we see here in the UK as well as in North America. And that cultural phenomenon is ruination as spectacle. So the theme of Thacker's book is, the central theme is horror. And he defines horror as a confrontation with the unthinkable. We saw a bit about this in the discussion of, I can't get the pronunciation right, or at least I've learned that my pronunciation was always wrong, of Cthulhu yesterday. This confrontation with the unthinkable, unknown. And central to Thacker's argument is an opposition which he builds up between the world for us, this is the world that we give meaning to and experience ourselves in relation to, and the world in itself. And he says the world in itself is a paradoxical concept because as soon as we start to think it, as soon as we start to act upon it, it becomes the world for us again. So this is sort of an unthinkable lurking on the horizon. And he says that horror is when this lurking on the horizon becomes present for us. So extinction, Thacker argues, this ubiquity of thinking about mass extinction is, for him, an impossible thought. And what he means by that is it's a thought which implies the absence of all human beings, therefore the absence of anything that could think that thought. It's the absence of all human beings. It requires the negation of all thought. And it confronts us with what he says is an unhuman, indifferent planet. And what he's trying to toy with there is the question of human significance in the face of deep time. What could be more insignificant in the face of the expanse of geological history than the human presence? We're not simply dwarfed by our planetary history, we're alienated from it, Thacker is arguing. We are nothing to this planet which we inhabit. Now, In the Dust of This Planet becomes a rather unlikely cultural phenomenon. This is an epidemiology that was traced very well in a 2012 National Public Radio show, Radiolab. The book was name-checked by the writers of the TV series True Detective. The cover of the book became a fashion statement printed on T-shirts and jackets. It was even stenciled onto the back of gun-wielding Jay-Z in a photo shoot. And following the NPR show, the book gained even more momentum and notoriety as the conservative political commentator Glenn Beck seized on it, and its popularity is a sign of the rising danger of nihilism for American culture. Okay, so how do we understand this cultural phenomenon? What I would argue is that dust, the dust which Thacker is talking about here, feeds a particular appetite for ruination as an aesthetic spectacle. And this is an appetite which I think we see most vividly in the kind of clickbait which we're all familiar with, which we term ruin porn. I think we've all seen these kinds of websites that offer. I've written down some quotes from here. An inside look at 9 abandoned malls. There is nothing creepier and more fascinating. these abandoned places in Michigan are disturbing and yet somehow beautiful. In fact, if you look at this sort of ruin porn of Detroit, you'd think that nobody lived there at all anymore. It's a very particular aesthetic of ruin. Abandoned, Hashima Island, ghostly remains. And so what this ruin porn allows us to do is it allows us to entertain a fantasy of future apocalypse. In fact, I think it's quite telling that the prominent urban exploration website in the UK is called 28 Days Later. It's full of these kinds of photos of people exploring abandoned buildings, and it's named after a post-apocalyptic zombie-type film. So what's going on here, I would argue anyway, is the titillation of thinking about the aftermath of catastrophe, even of what Thacker would call a world without us. And the core feature of any of these kinds of ruin porn is precisely that there are no humans in the frame of the picture. Now, contrary to Thacker's chosen sources, he associates this horror particularly with black metal. That's what he wants to talk about. I think there's far more in common between what Thacker's writing and nature writing, or certain genres of nature writing, than there is between Thacker and black metal. So, for example, if we look at Robert McFarlane's writing, and I've got a quote here from something where he's channeling Alan Wiseman's World Without Us, but he's talking specifically about the context of what Cambridge would look like after humans. He says, asphalt and paving have been cracked by freeze and thaw cycles. Soil has blown into the fissures and plants have taken root. Sycamore seedlings pry up paving slabs, shift granite curb edges. Bindweed laces the spokes of rusting bicycles. With the city's flood defences unmanaged, sluices and bridges block with debris, and the river begins to explore the possible extents of its domain. Good news for little egrets, herons, and Phragmites reeds. Now, the point that I'm wanting to make from this, and reading it alongside Thacker, is this vision of the world without us is not horror in this context, not horror at all. Rather, it's a romantic lyricism, and it's a romantic lyricism that's only achieved fully in the absence of humans. It's a pleasing fantasy, I think, for us, and I think all of these kinds of fatalism that Thacker is channeling are pleasing fantasies because it's a way of imagining the planet waking up without us and saying with some relief, oh, that was all a bad dream. And I think there's a romance here of ruination which extracts us as humans and our responsibility, extracts us from our responsibility in the present moment here. Okay, so I want to move on to a different figuration of dust now, which I think takes the image of dust in a different direction. And that's the way dust is used in Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, promulgated in 2015. In the encyclical, it's written, "We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements." I think this calls to mind, first and foremost, the liturgy of Ash Wednesday and the ashing with the words, "Remember, man, that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." And this is a liturgy, this is a sacramental, I think, of humiliation. Recall that the ashes that are distributed on Ash Wednesday are the burned palms of Palm Sunday. So our great moment of pride and celebration becomes this one of mourning. So there's an act of humiliation here, but it's an act of humiliation which is also a rebirth. And I think in Laudato Si, I think what is important here is that it's presented not primarily as an ecological teaching. It's not a climate encyclical per se, in the way that I think the media often discusses it, but time and again it refers to itself as part of Catholic social teaching. It is social teaching. And why I think that's important is because it's saying there is an inseparable bond, I'm quoting here, between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. So there's a sweeping away, or an attempt anyway in the encyclical to sweep away the social environmental divide as well as the public-private divide. There's a demolition of dualisms going on here. And it's in this context that the encyclical tells us the earth itself, the earth herself, that's very important. I made it in it. The Pope has it as a her. The earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. Now, there's a sense of catastrophism which permeates this encyclical. The very fact that it's addressed to all people of goodwill is, I think, very telling, because that echoes Pope John XXIII's Pacem in Terris, which was, again, an encyclical promulgated in the face of an existential threat. In that context, it was the threat of nuclear annihilation in the context of the Cold War. And I think what we see throughout is the idea of seeking to mobilize a collectivity that can face that looming threat. And the collectivity here, the social, which is being described, is a relationship between creatures. And this is, I think, the telling thing about the use of Laudato Si, the use of St. Francis's Canticle of the Sun as the title here, because that's a poem which uses kinship terms to refer to different facets of nature. So it's a social relationship which is opened out onto all creatures. Now, in this context, dust looms as catastrophe. It is what we will return to, after all. But it also has potency because, and I'll quote from the encyclical again, it is our humble conviction that the divine and the human meet in the slightest detail, in the seamless garment of God's creation, in the last speck of dust in our planet. And the contrast, I think, here is very marked, because from this point of view, what is said in the encyclical is, hence, nothing is indifferent to us, contrary to the indifference of the horror of philosophy which Eugene Thacker is talking about. So here is a use of dust which places us in an intimate sociality with the planet, rather than a usage of dust which extracts us through ruination. Okay, I want to turn finally to a third figuration of dust, and I think at this point we have to cut the sound for our live audience, but I'll be back in a minute.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. And then okay. What the rapper here is spitting out there in that song, Leave Me My Homeland, is his saying, I'm the owner of this dust, shoro, left to me by my parents and ancestors. At least I didn't lose that to others. And what I think we see here is something which is playing with an ubiquitous genre in Mongolian popular music. I carry out anthropological research in Mongolia. Whenever you go on a bus or a taxi, they play music videos in which people are going out to the countryside. There's this idea of hudud yavi, let's go to the countryside. And so the idea of a rapper going out to the countryside, of the horsehead fiddle, of these incorporation of folk tunes, is not in any way surprising. But what is surprising is the kind of countryside that's being represented in this video. It's playing with the genre, but it's providing a kind of countryside which is the countryside turned to dust. So this is a contrast with the bucolic imagination of the green countryside, which looms large in the national imagination in Mongolia. Now, Gregory Delaplace, he argues that authenticity is a central concern of Mongolian rap. It's exploring what it means to be a real Mongol. Or rather, he says, the question is, what is preventing us from being real Mongolian nowadays? So returning to this rap, Leaving My Homeland, what's interesting here is the sense of how moral failure, the failure to be Mongolians, marks time. And this is explicit. He says, I fear that we see the future where Mongolia will be called a desert. And the damage he's describing is the slow violence that's done to Mongolia's natural history as well as its national history. And this is portrayed as a moral failure. Real wealth isn't what's under you. Real wealth comes with the growing plants. Gold, silver, people can't eat money. It seems we don't know that herds eat grass, people eat the herds. There's a chain of causality here which has been severed. He ends the first verse by asking, Hen bayan, Mongol bayan, who's rich, Mongolians are rich. So there's a number of environmental anxieties at play here. The most prominent, I think, is pasture land degradation. In the future, one blade of grass is more valuable than gold, attributed to global climate change. But also, we see in him calling out from this future vision of the countryside, calling out back to the ancestors, real wealth isn't what's under you. He's pointing an accusing finger at mining activity, tapping into a widespread ambivalence towards extractive industries, which can be understood as both ecologically and morally polluting. And these fears take on an expressly nationalist flavour, given the concern that land in the nation is being bought and sold by outsiders. So this depiction of slow violence here, harm whose full extent is displaced in time, is figured by way of genealogy. He looks back to the ancestors and forward to descendants. But that capacity to see generations through time is dependent on ecology. And ecology can't take the people's fertility is destroyed in the loss of the land's fertility. He says, can we live without rivers and streams? What will our descendants depend on after my time? The future will curse us. And later he says, I'm an unlucky man. I'm a man without destiny. Zayagui, without destiny. Now, this idea, this video of Leaving My Homeland, showing Mongolians of the future left wandering through a barren geology, trying to piece together a history from what they find buried in the dust, a portrait of Genghis Khan, a sign pointing the way to a mine, photograph of trees by a lake, a dribble of water in a plastic bottle. What we see here is a perceived rupture in time which requires reconstruction. And this is what shocks, I think, in the image of a future homeland that has become dust. It confronts the watcher and the listener with a vision of severance. And the question, which I want to end on with this third figure of dust, is the question is whether such a recognition of dust as severance is an end or a beginning. Is it an abnegation of human social agency and moral responsibility, or rather is it a call to take action? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Questions for Richard?
Thank you for that. At the beginning, you spoke about the divergence between the sort of like deep time and then the sort of sudden visceral that we're sort of used to, especially with like the multimedia age. And I'm just thinking, do you think cinematography, visual culture sort of studies, and time-lapse videos, and maybe raps and stuff, can actually converge those two different things, in which slow time can become visceral through the sort of condensing of cataclysm over time. I don't know, it's something that sort of Rob Nixon struggles with in environmentalism for the poor with slow violence. Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, the immediate knee-jerk reaction would be to say, and I talk about ruin porn and ruination as spectacle here, is that quite often what images provide is instantaneous gratification. So it's this collapsed present rather than the expanse of deep time. That said, I think it's precisely, the question then is precisely how do we take genres which have become associated with presentism, with consumption in the present moment, and do something which is more expansive with them. I mean, I've been working up in a project in Orkney with an artist there, Anne Bevan, who works on the landscape of Orkney and how it transforms itself over deep time. And part of what we're trying to do there is we're walking with people and we're just trying to see how their political lives are embedded in the deep time of that landscape, in the presence of uranium there, and the erosion which takes away the landscape. So I think that there are possibilities for dialogue there, but I don't necessarily think that they immediately spring from the use of these images. Rather, I think it's a subversion of it, but that's my view.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to ask you, I really like the idea that you were discussing about how ruin porn is kind of the idea of the Earth waking up and thinking, oh, thank God it was just a dream that humans were here. One of the things that strikes me from my research, because I'm intrigued by ruin porn as well, and the urbex movement, is that it appears as the exact opposite of new urban development. So you've got the shininess, the glass, the steel, all the kind of very pristine environments that are being created in new urban developments. And I wonder whether you think that this is something to do with people rejecting that model of living and trying to go back to the dirty, kind of dilapidated way of living. I'm reminded of Walter Benjamin's idea of the kind of dirty, sexy city, where as soon as you start to sanitize the city, you lose all form of democratization and belonging of people who can practice whatever they want. Just wonder if you could speak to that for me.
That's interesting. I mean, to go back to your paper yesterday, I mean, if we're to juxtapose these kind of images with the kinds of images of these green urban developments that property developers use, I think part of what's interesting there is that I think they could be interpreted potentially as ways that put the lie to the sustainability of those. You know, here is something which is presented as sustainable. We'll flash forward, and here we see where the actual end point of these is. The end point of any of these shiny dreams is ruination. So I think there's scope there for a certain kind of critique. My worry about it, as part of a wider genre of ruination as spectacle, is that it does have this abnegation of moral responsibility, rather than presenting something which we're taking action in relation to. It presents a particular telos. It's kind of fatalistic in the relationship to that. That's my feeling about it. And the reason I have these other two figures of dust, I don't think it has to be that way. I don't think that images of ruin have to be portrayed in that way, but I think that's one of the main thrusts of the way they're used.
Thank you, and thank you particularly for introducing me to Mongolian rap, which I will explore.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I have just, not really a question, a couple of very minor observations on the other two aspects of your paper. You quoted from the encyclical, which of course has a lot of biblical resonances and analogies, and the idea of the first man being made of the earth and returning to dust. Just as a minor point that you might want to think, the reason it works is because of a rabbinical exegetical technique that a lot of Hebrew understanding of the Bible is based on word plays and puns. So it's based on the idea of Adam and Adamah, between the first man and the earth, and that's one of the reasons why we have that association. But my other observation is that you talked about ruin porn, as you mentioned it, and there isn't a fantasy of ruin porn, there's a real place, and it's called Chernobyl. And if you want to see a place where humans no longer are, and which has been left at a moment of human evacuation, go online and have a look at photographs now of intrepid people who've gone and actually documented Chernobyl.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is quite interesting because I think Chernobyl, I've seen some of those images, and I think one of the things that's interesting is how something which appears to be a horrific story of human damage to the planet comes to be construed as a certain story of hope, because you see the ways in which the planet has been recolonized, much in the way that Robert McFarlane is talking about here. And I mean, I think that is both intrepid and also there is a hope there. My problem with that would come from the fact that that story of hope, if it involves bracketing out the first stage, which is the recognition of the harm that we have wrought and the possibility of acting in different ways, then I think that's counterproductive. But yeah, I think those are both really good points. So thank you.
Anyone else?
Thank you. I was riveted by your disquisition on different ways of looking at dust. I was vaguely thinking about Philip Pullman's concept of dust in those Lyra books. I was wondering whether you see that as any way related to your paper.
I have to admit, my PhD student, who is a very big Philip Pullman fan, has nagged me in the past to read for precisely this reason, and I've said, yeah, I'll get around to it, and I haven't got around to it, and now that ghost is coming back to haunt me, because if I had, but I'll add that plea to his and try and I mean, how do you feel he's using it? Because
It's got religious connotations. Clearly, it's got religious connotations, very much so. I was trying to work it out. I thought you might have done it already.
Right. No, not yet.
Can't
but
throw much light.
Yeah, I'll come back once I have.
Thank you, Richard.
Cheers.
Thank you.